This is a continuation of my other video entitled MetaGod Morals and Value. If you haven't seen it already, you might consider watching it first. I ended up talking with him for a couple more hours. Again, I can't remember everything word for word, but some interesting stuff came up that I thought I'd share. Obviously, some version of the first cause argument is always guaranteed to come up. And I mentioned one way I like to approach this in the last conversation. In this conversation, I approached it another way. Our inability to conceive of there not being a first cause is just a cognitive bias. We can't imagine an infinite regress, so we reject the notion of there being one. Our minds need closure, so we assert that there has to have been a first cause. But we haven't demonstrated that an infinite regress is impossible in principle. To demonstrate that an infinite regress is actually possible, I pointed to the number line as an example. If you subtract 1 from any number, you get the number that comes before that number on the number line. Before -1, there's -2. Before that, there's -3. And of course, there's no end to it. Negative numbers are a perfect example of an infinite regress. So an infinite regress is definitely possible. He objected that even though this was an example of an infinite regress, it wasn't the same because one number doesn't cause another number. I pointed out that in a way, one number does have a kind of causal relation to the number that precedes it. 1 causes 2 when it's added to itself. Every number is, in a sense, caused by either adding or subtracting 1 to or from the number that comes before or after it on the number line. This is kind of a strange way of thinking about both causation and numbers, though. So I brought up a form of Hume's argument against causation. When we observe that one thing follows another, we associate the two and perceive one as having caused the other. But causation itself is something that can't really be empirically determined. We can only empirically determine that repeated experiments show consistent correlation. I recommend reading Hume's arguments related to causal relations, but I don't want to tackle it here, because then I would have to drink a whole bottle of whiskey to make the pain in my brain go away. The only point I want to make is that the Aristotelian account of causation is necessary to the first cause argument. And Hume offers some challenges to the Aristotelian account of causation. So it isn't clear to me that there is any difference between a causal sequential chain and an acausal sequential chain. And like I said, I'm not completely sure whether we should say that the number line is causal or acausal in nature. In any case, I've shown that an infinite regress is possible in principle. And I'm not sure of any solid reason to think that an infinite regress is possible with an acausal chain, but not a causal chain. Why would one be possible but not the other? Maybe there is a good answer to this question, but I couldn't think of one offhand, and neither could he. So he was willing to concede that point, at least for the moment. And I pointed out that the number line demonstrates not only that an infinite regress can exist, but also that everything can come from nothing. Every number is the sum of its parts. 5 is the sum of 2 and 3, for example. What is 0? 0 is the sum of every number and its negative. So infinity and negative infinity exist within 0. In other words, everything exists because nothing exists. Nothing could be defined as everything that could possibly exist plus the negation of that thing. He challenged me on the idea that things have opposites in the same way that numbers do. He objected that things aren't numbers, and that there's no such thing as a negative apple. My answer to this is loosely based on process philosophy. An apple is not a substance, but a process. What we call an apple is actually a process of growth and decay. The process of the apple coming into being is a movement away from non-being or nothingness, in the same way that the number 3 is a movement away from 0 on the number line. -3 is a movement from +3 back to 0 on the number line. In the same way, everything that comes into existence returns again to nothingness. The process of coming into existence is negated by the return to non-existence. This is a movement away from nothing and a return to nothing, just as every number is a movement away from 0 and every negative number is a return to 0 from that number. When I say that 3 minus 3 equals 0, I'm saying that if I move away from 0 towards infinity by a measure of 3, and move back towards negative infinity by a measure of 3, I will arrive back at 0. And as long as 0 exists, every positive and negative number exists too. No number can exist unless all of the numbers that add up to that number exist. 0 can only exist if both every number and its opposite exist. Nothing can only exist if everything and its opposite exist. If nothing exists, then everything exists. Everything comes from nothing and returns to nothing, but nothing is ever lost. Because even when everything returns to nothing, it still exists within nothing. If a theologian says that God has no beginning and no end, then God is 0. God is nothing. Some myths teach that God created the universe out of nothing, and others teach that God created the universe out of himself. Both say the same thing. God is nothing. An atheist are right to say that God doesn't exist. God is that from which all of existence emanates from and returns back into. God doesn't exist, and God is all that exists. I'm an atheist. I'm also God. I just don't believe that I exist. I don't need to believe. I know. You can decide for yourself whether I'm saying something profoundly absurd or something absurdly profound. I'm not sure whether it makes any difference, truthfully. But it left my Catholic friend silent for a moment. And silence is the sum of everything that can be said and its opposite. If you imagine a circle, and you imagine a point somewhere along the circumference of the circle, and you label that point as 0. And if you move clockwise from 0 along the circumference of that circle, and imagine that clockwise movement as the positive numbers, and if you move counterclockwise from 0 along the circumference of that circle on the opposite hemisphere, then you can imagine that movement as the negative numbers. And as positive and negative numbers move around the circle in opposite directions, you can imagine positive and negative infinity meeting at a point along the circle opposite from the 0 point. And all positive numbers move from 0 towards positive infinity, and all negative numbers move from 0 towards negative infinity. And at that point, where positive and negative infinity meet, all pairs of opposites merge and return to 0. Every male and female creature enters the ark 2 by 2. The earth is destroyed. But the flood waters recede, and the earth is born anew, and all the creatures again emerge from the ark. Again the first human is divided into male and female. Again the light is separated from the darkness, the sky from the ground, the sea from the dry land. And then God rests from the work of creation, and begins the work of drawing all of creation, which has become separated from him, back to himself. Creation and redemption. And the process of creation repeats itself in an infinite regress and an infinite progress. And yet nothing is created and nothing is destroyed. Nothing is eternal. Nothing is the first and the last, the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega. Somehow, the conversation emerged again from the silence, and we ended up returning to the idea of the divine theory of morality. which I consider to be an authoritarian argument, as I explain in depth in the video entitled The Moral Argument for God and Escape from the Garden of Ignorance. And I outlined my interpretation of the garden story, which I won't repeat here in its entirety. The long and short of it is that the serpent didn't lie to Eve or deceive her in any way, as we're usually told. He told her that if she ate of the tree of knowledge, her eyes would be opened, and she would become like God, knowing both good and evil. And according to the Bible itself, that's exactly what happened. The story of the Tower of Babel presents us with a similarly confusing narrative. Apparently, the God of the Old Testament desires to keep mankind ignorant and divided. He fears mankind, and is especially threatened when we move toward knowledge and unity. Why would this be the case? I asked my companion to imagine living in North Korea, or in some other totalitarian state. I asked him to imagine that a certain book was forbidden, and that the penalty for reading it was death. I asked him to imagine that there were laws against people assembling together. This would make sense if the dictator's power depended on keeping the people in ignorance and divided against each other. It would make sense if that book contained information that would expose his propaganda. It would make sense if he feared that if people came together they might overthrow him. So why does the God of the Old Testament behave so much like an evil dictator? And how does his behavior make sense if he's good? I pointed out to him that Paul calls the devil the god of this world. And of course the Valentinian Gnostics claimed that Paul was their leader. Valentinus claims to have been initiated by Theudas, and claims that Theudas was initiated by Paul. And of course the Gnostics did believe that the God of this world, the God of the Old Testament, was a malevolent deity. The God of the Old Testament was none other than the devil himself. Jesus is not the son of this devil. Jesus is called the morning star. He's the light bearer. He's Lucifer. He is the serpent from the Garden of Eden, who brings gnosis to mankind. Lucifer didn't fall from heaven. He was sent from heaven. He was sent as a messenger of light to reveal to mankind the way to escape from the Garden of Ignorance. Of course, to a Catholic, this is the ultimate heresy. And in another time and place, torture would have been used to make me confess to this heresy, and then I would have been led to the stake and burned alive. Times have changed, though. My inquisitor only stared off into space, as if looking for a way to prove this heresy false. He could only answer to the effect that if the God of the Old Testament were the true God, then everything he commands must be moral and good, and that the sin of the garden wasn't so much the eating of the fruit as it was the act of disobedience. But of course, Adam and Eve couldn't know that disobedience was evil unless they had knowledge of good and evil. And to partake of the knowledge of good and evil was an act of disobedience, so they were in a double bind. Plus, it's only good to obey the God of the Old Testament if the God of the Old Testament is good. If the God of the Old Testament is evil, then it's good to disobey him. So you can only know if obedience to the God of the Old Testament is good or evil if you know whether the God of the Old Testament is good or evil. And the only way to know that is if you have knowledge of good and evil. And the only way to have the knowledge of good and evil is to disobey the God of the Old Testament and eat the forbidden fruit. So to do good, Eve had to disobey the God of the Old Testament. And if disobeying the God of the Old Testament is good, then the God of the Old Testament is evil. And of course the fact that the God of the Old Testament would forbid the knowledge of good and evil is enough proof that he's evil. And the fact that the serpent revealed the knowledge of good and evil is enough proof that he's good. In a very surprising move, my companion asserted that even if there was a false god, there had to be a true God above him. And I wondered if he was aware that he had just converted to Gnosticism. Like a serpent, I almost came out of my skin. But instead, I asked him how he could be sure that true God wasn't just another false God, and that there wasn't another God above him. He went back to the infinite regress argument, and I pointed out that I had already established the possibility of infinite regress. He looked disturbed, so I made a sudden jump to a completely different point and asked him how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. He answered that an infinite number of angels could fit on the head of a pin, because angels didn't occupy space. I offered a fist bump and smiled. I told him I was glad we could find something to agree on. Angels are dimensionless, but of course, if they're dimensionless, they can't really be said to occupy dimensional space, which means they can't be said to be on the head of a pin at all, and I left it at that. I didn't connect these last two dots. If I had, he would have become God, and the world would have ended. I moved on to the idea that if he lived in North Korea, or some other communist dictatorship, he would have been brainwashed since birth to believe in the power, wisdom, and goodness of the supreme leader. If someone else read the forbidden book, he might believe that person had done evil. And if I pressed him on how simply reading a book could be evil, he might respond that the crime wasn't so much the reading of the book as much as the act of disobeying the supreme leader. He might mock me for suggesting that there was another world beyond the militarized border fence where the supreme leader's power didn't extend. He could hardly imagine a world where men are free because he doesn't even see that he's a slave. And he would have some resistance to the idea that he and the supreme leader are created equal, and that the supreme leader's power and authority are illusions, which ultimately depend for their existence upon the consent of the people to be governed. And if the people were to read the forbidden book and be unified by the knowledge contained within its pages, they would all see that the man behind the curtain wasn't wearing any clothes. And if it weren't for the fact that he had inflicted so much death and suffering on the land, they might even laugh at the elaborate joke that had been played on them all, and welcome him to live among them now as an equal, and find his place in the New World Order. But of course it's too late for that. If he's allowed to live, he'll be cast into the dungeon he had built to punish those who rebelled against him, along with those who still remained loyal to him. And so shall the God of the Old Testament, the Demiurge, be cast into the lake of fire he created for Lucifer and his liberated legion, along with Michael and the loyal angels, who are truly demons, archons. And of course, to my companion, it sounds as if I'm a devil worshipper. But from my perspective, it's my friend who worships the devil, because the God of the Old Testament is the real Satan. What he calls orthodox doctrine, I call a satanic deception. What he calls heresy, I call the forbidden knowledge that liberates lost souls imprisoned in the kingdom of the satanic god of this world. The figure he calls the devil, I call Lucifer, the Christ, who has descended into the world of darkness below as a light bearer, and as a revealer of the world of light above, of the kingdom of heaven, of the Father of light, of the all in all, and of our own true nature. I could see that this complete inversion of his entire view of the world was too much for him to take in. So I made a couple of jokes to lighten things up again, and went back to a little small talk, and then ended the conversation on a friendly note. And the listener should be cautious about taking everything I've said too literally. The use of counter-narrative is only a technique. A deeply held dogma is like a number. It's a deviation from truth. Truth is like 0. When a person has become attached to the number 5, the most direct path of return I can offer them is the number -5. If this is too much to take all at once, the return can be accomplished through degrees. I could first offer them -1, which would move them from 5 to 4, slightly closer to 0, but only slightly. Then I could offer them -2, which would bring them to +2. Maybe it would be necessary then to offer them -3. This would bring them to -1. It would swing their pendulum of belief just slightly too far in the other direction, before coming back to rest at 0 when I offered them +1. And it's worth pointing out to my regular viewers that I do frequently make use of this technique. I'll end there. I hope you found this discussion entertaining and enlightening. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, and check out some of my other videos as well as my website. Donations are appreciated. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.